Good afternoon, this is Brad Keller, and welcome to our webinar on Vendor Assessment Due Diligence, Managed Services as a Best Practice. During today's webinar, we're going to talk about a little bit of the background on what constitutes some best practices around vendor assessment due diligence and how you can use managed services to help you deliver against those requirements and truly use it as a best practice. John Police has joined me, and I'll have John introduce himself as we talk about our respective companies. So before we begin, just a little bit of background on Prevalent. We've been around since 2004, and we've been identified as a visionary and live in that part of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. At Prevalent, we focus almost exclusively on helping third-party risk management and dealing with cybersecurity risks, and have a whole solution suite for that. We also are a sponsor and supporter not only of the Shared Assessments Program, but of the Shared Assessment Certified Third-Party Risk Professional Program, which is the only program out there right now that can provide you with specific training and information on third-party risk management. John, why don't you go ahead and give us some background on Prevalent Security Solutions?
Sure, thanks, Brad. This is John Police. I'm the VP of Sales at Prevalent Security Solutions. So Prevalent Security Solutions is an organization that's been in business for more than 13 years, and we exclusively focus on security and compliance products and services as they relate to the enterprise and some larger mid-market organizations. And we span across multiple verticals in industries. We break our business down into three components, one being Technology Partner Solutions, which is a value-added reseller entity of our business, and we provide specific solutions that are leading solutions in the space for security and compliance. We also have a professional services division as well that provides consulting services for implementation and deployment of the technology partner-related products and solutions that we support, but also from a general perspective around security and compliance and risk management. The third entity of our organization is around vendor risk managed services, which we're here to talk about today.
Great, thanks, John. Now, before we dig into sort of the meat of our discussion this afternoon, I want to level set a little bit and have the folks on the call sort of answer this question for themselves. We're not going to share these results, but to get everybody in sort of the proper state of mind, I'd like everybody to sort of ask themselves, the question that you see on the screen, which is, do you conduct vendor assessments as part of your vendor onboarding? If so, take a look at the choices below and decide for yourself which category you belong in, right? And they range everything from you always complete vendor assessments before a vendor contract is executed, all the way down to you do it often, but 75% of the time or more, that's not done until after your vendor contracts are executed. Okay, just take a moment to think about that. And as we go through our conversation this afternoon, what I'd like to have you do is, if you're not in that top category, and I will tell you from experience there are very few people who are, then we can help you get through this and give you some tips and some clues for how you can get closer to having the vast majority of your vendors assessed before your contracts have been executed. But first, let's take a look at, why is this important? Why are we looking at vendor assessments and vendor due diligence? And, the simple truth is that your security, your cybersecurity, use the current buzz terms, is really only as good as the security of your critical vendors. Okay, you can put great cybersecurity in place, you can control your data very well, but if your vendors aren't doing the same thing, then you've got an awful lot that sits at risk. So it's really about what do you need to be doing to have a confidence level in your vendors. And what's interesting, and I love this Poneman study, it was done last year. It's called The Tone at the Top and Third-Party Risk. And Poneman Institute they do a lot of different studies. They've done several now in the area of third-party risk. This was completed last April. And really, the key points here is to work from the bottom up. So it's very interesting in that the study identified that essentially 3/4 of the folks who responded and participated in this study identified that third-party risk was very serious risk issues, and that risks in this area are significantly increasing. All right, so which means it's a big piece of every company's risk exposure. The interesting point is that even though 3/4 of the respondents identified that third-party risk is a big risk area and it's increasing, only about 1/4 of those folks were able to say that their third-party risk process was effective. So we see a big gap here. So even though companies are identifying and realizing that this is a big risk area, there's a big gap in addressing it and making sure that these risks are being adequately protected. So, why is that? Why do we have this big gap between the realization that this risk exists and it's increasing and effectively addressing it? Okay. Well, part of that is the sheer scope of what it means to do an effective third-party risk assessment. For those of you who've ever seen one of my presentations before, you'll know this is one of my favorite slides, despite the fact that there are folks who take exception to my color choices, but they are what they are, and I'm sticking with them to the end. But when we look at things, and I'll tell you, this is a great snapshot and something for you if you're doing third-party risk. This ought to be sitting on your cube wall, your office wall, to help remind you of what's in play, right? The third-party risk assessment life cycle, which ties in very closely with the vendor life cycle as identified by OCC. And what we're really going to focus on today are the first 2 phases of this, the pre-assessment phase and the assessment phase. And this visually helps remind us all of what happens in these phases, right? And really what I want to reinforce here is getting phase 1 right is a critical component of being able to effectively execute across the rest of the life cycle. If you don't have the right foundation, you don't have requirements and stakeholders properly defined on board, and you've got those processes established, you're not going to be able to effectively execute across the rest of this. So let's dive in a little bit more, and let's take a little deeper look at what happens in the pre-assessment phase and the assessment phase. Okay. The biggest thing that comes up, and we counter it regularly. In fact, I did a series of CISO briefings across the country the end of last year, and it was very interesting that uniformly in all these briefings, and we were from D.C. to San Francisco and various points in the country in between, but we heard very consistently from more than half of the CISOs we talked to that they really didn't know where to start. Okay. So it's really about where do you start? Which vendors do I assess? And those vendors are going to fall into 2 different categories, right? It's what do I do for onboarding? What's my initial vendor assessment look like? And what do I do for ongoing assessments? What are those periodic, those renewals, those reassessments, however you want to call them, take place? And this is an important point to get right. And again, we're talking about this within the context of managed services to first make sure that we're all on the same page with what does it take to do these assessments. what's the scope and breadth of what we're taking on here look like, right? And deciding who you're going to assess, which vendors are going to be assessed, is critically important because we all know that everyone has a limited resource pool to do this. One of the big drivers and the big obstacles to effective third-party risk assessment is having the resources to get this done right. That's why folks get a little caught up sometimes in knowing where to start because they want to make sure that they're properly allocating their limited resources and using them the best way. So that's really about figuring out which vendors should be assessed and making sure that you're taking those on in a prioritized way. We've got to do risk ranking. We have to figure out what the services are that they do. But it really starts with what vendors do I have to assess. From there, decisions have to be made about what's going to be assessed. What's that scope look like? Again, to make sure that we're properly leveraging the scarce resources that are available to make this happen, assessments have to be scoped. And these are some of the factors, but these are probably the most important high-level factors that go into scoping assessments, right? There's vendor risk ratings, the type of services provided, the data. What's very interesting now, as we dive down a little bit further into this, is when we talk about the type of data that a vendor has, it's not just the type of data, but it's where is that data reside? Where does it go? Okay. So is that data moving off-prem? Is that data going to a vendor subcontractor? Okay. Most recently, what we've seen added to the scope of the assessment is availability. In looking at availability, when we scope and try and identify who we're going to assess, the need for the vendor services to be available comes into play. And this is really important because what it's doing in many instances is it's expanding the scope of the vendors that we have to assess. Interestingly enough, I just did a quick little blog on an incident that happened. Cayden Security identified a breach incident that was recorded during RSA, and it's very interesting because Krebs is saying, hey, here's how you can cover up and hide a breach incident. Announce it subtly during RSA when everybody's tied up and busy. But in this instance, the breach happened at a software provider that allowed folks to log in and do downloads, but more importantly, pushed out regular updates. And what was compromised was their server that pushed out the updates, and the updates were now pushing out malware. This is a service that a lot of folks may take for granted. They're pushing out updates, but those updates are going into their system. And if those updates are tainted, if they contain malware and that malware is going into the application, you can see the problems that happen from there. So, therein, how important is it that you get those updates? How important is you get those services, and is an interruption in those services going to compromise your ability to deliver yours? So, those all tie in to help us really look at who do we have to talk to in scoping the assessments. And of course, all of that drives down and tells us, well, what do we need to ask? Right? So what are we assessing? You don't want to overburden yourselves or the vendors by not properly scoping the assessments. And you'll notice that I said you won't want to overburden the vendors or yourselves because it's a two-way street. Okay? If you're asking a lot more questions than the vendor really needs to answer, you're overloading that vendor. You're going to get less cooperation and participation from that vendor in the process, and you're likely to not get as accurate results. By the same token, everything that you send out to the vendor has to come back to you, and you've got to review it and analyze it. So if you're getting back in a lot of assessment due diligence that's not relevant to determining the risk that that vendor presents, then you are occupying those scarce resources that we talked about at the beginning with work that doesn't add any value to the risk assessments. So, getting the scope right is really critically important here. The other pieces that you've got to focus on is not just what they're doing and putting them in the right risk categories. Are they critical risk? Are they high risk? But also, how are you going to obtain this documentation? And here's part of the challenges with the process. Okay, obtaining vendor information and documentation is a tremendously resource-intensive process. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of resources, and you're having this done, making sure that questions are answered, that you're getting it right, is a very manual process, and it's very time-consuming. And keep in mind that this is being performed now by risk professionals. You don't really need to be a highly skilled risk professional to gather a lot of this information and make sure that it's accurate. You do to understand it and review it. But the analysis that we performed and that I saw in use cases while I was the program director at Shared Assessments was that about half of the time, however much time you determine you use or you should use to conduct a vendor assessment, half of that time is going to be spent sending out and collecting your vendor due diligence, gathering it all up, making sure it's accurate, making sure that the vendor understands what they need to provide you with, and getting that information from the vendors. Okay? I mean, and unfortunately what we see happening as part of the process, and I see it happening with a lot of companies, is that assessments start to be scoped not based on what a company needs to know and understand to be able to effectively evaluate the risk controls that are in place at a vendor, but assessments start to be scoped based on how much time and how many resources you have in order to conduct the assessment. So instead of saying, here is the body of knowledge that I need to have from this vendor, and it constitutes 500 questions, and it constitutes this document set, what ends up happening is that I have resources that can only get through about 150 questions and really can only look at one or two documents. So I'm going to alter and I'm going to scope my assessments not based on what I need, but what I believe my resources can properly consume and process. Okay? And when that happens, you are essentially knowingly leaving out gaps. Okay? Certainly there's a balance point, and that's what the scoping effort is all about, that says I need to get the appropriate level of risk information for what I can process. But when resource availability and time to conduct assessments become the driver behind what information and what your due diligence is going to look like, you are necessarily going to miss things. And you're not going to evaluate and identify those other vendors that are critical to the process that fall outside of the norm that can really hurt your business. Okay, so that's part of the driving problem. And when we look at the assessment challenges here, it starts with what we looked at the beginning, and that's the alignment. You know, the alignment between what you're doing from corporate risk standards and what your vendors are doing. Because essentially, what should happen is your vendors should be mirror imaging your programs. Okay, in the perfect world, everyone has top quality internal IT security and data protection requirements and provisions in place, and they should push those down, and that's the same requirements that their vendors should be marching to. The problem is finding a way to balance the need for detailed information with the resources that we have. And equally difficult and challenging is compiling all of this information in a way that it can be effectively understood and reported on. Manual assessment processes, particularly if they're done by multiple people in the organization, what that means is your assessments are information is coming in probably via email. Any individual assessment is probably coming in multiple emails to one individual, which address questionnaires that you've sent out, document requests that you have. So if an assessment has 5 or 6 different communication points times however many assessments that person does, further complicated by multiple people doing the assessments, what happens is all of your vendor assessment due diligence is spread out across your email system, and it's not consolidated or compiled in an effective way where it can be analyzed and reported on in a meaningful manner. Now, that obviously presents its own special challenges and problems, particularly if you have an employee who goes on PTO, you have an employee that leaves, gets sick. It makes it essentially impossible for anyone to fill in and pick up the slack when you have a resource unavailable at the time. But more importantly, what it does is it makes it almost impossible for you to provide management with a meaningful report of what your vendor risk looks like. If things are being compiled manually across different email accounts, even if it's all placed into the same SharePoint server or file, there still is no effective way to compile all that and provide management with the kind of meaningful information that they need to have today, which is not only what are the risks presented from this particular vendor and how are we addressing them, but more and more often we're seeing board level and certainly senior executive enterprise risk level committees want to see what is the risk presented from me outsourcing a particular category of activity. What's the risk presented from outsourcing data centers, data center backups? Fill in the blank for what this is. And the reason why senior executives are focused on it is your regulators are focused on it. If you're in a regulated environment, healthcare, financial services, soon to be energy, we're seeing that that's what the examiners are looking at is what's your risk from outsourcing particular areas of activity. And you can't report on that effectively if that's not all consolidated in one place. Okay. The other big problem with assessment challenge and the challenge of assessments is it's a very static point in time look. Okay, it's giving you one piece, one look, and the due diligence is only as good and as accurate on the date that it was transmitted, but you're not getting ongoing information. And part of the reason you're not getting that is your resources are so tied up collecting and examining the due diligence that they're getting that they don't have any time to keep things more current and assessed. So, you know, the real challenge here is that the minimum amount of resources that companies are able to invest in this process while at the same time addressing this substantial and significant risk picture that third-party risk presents. So, you know, sort of with that as a backdrop, again, I'm going to ask folks another polling question. And before we dive into this, I just want to remind everybody, you know, please feel free, if you've got a question, send that in on the chat. Drop that in if you've got a question about what we're talking about or one of the polling questions or anything else that comes to mind. Please feel free to send that in on the chat, and we'll address those at the end because we're going to save some time to address some questions that you may have. So as it pops into your mind, pop it into the chat window and send it on to us. But while you're doing that, take a moment to ask yourself this question to kind of help level set things a little bit. We've talked about, at a high level, what does it mean to do vendor assessments? We looked at the pre-assessment process. We looked at the assessment process and the challenges that happen there. So, I'd like to have, folks on the phone ask themselves, the question that you see in front of you, and that is, do you believe you have the resources necessary to initiate and complete vendor assessments on existing vendors in a timely manner? Okay. What category do you fall into? Are you not sure? Are you getting through some percentage of them? Or do you fit into that unique, rarefied category that says, boy, we are able to complete all our required annual assessments, any scheduled periodic assessment, on time and completely, and report that to management? So take a second to think about where you fall here, particularly in light of what we've just chatted about, as far as what's the scope and level of this effort look like, along with the challenges that you're faced in confronting and addressing this. Okay? So once you kind of got that in your head, and I think in most instances, folks are going to fall somewhere in between we do most but not all. I know I'm actually fairly constantly surprised, even in large organizations, large regulated organizations that have been doing this for a long time and know it's important, the number of assessments that they just can't get to. And it's significant, and a significant percentage of the ones that, in theory, they know they really should get through. And I suspect that most of the folks on the phone are going to fall into that same category, only because you're not alone, and that, in fact, is where most people land. So let's revisit our third-party risk assessment life cycle. We've been talking about phases 1 and 2 because really, for the purposes of our conversation today, these are the areas that are really best suited for outsourcing, for having managed services help you. Having managed services help you get it right and have you actually conduct the assessments. And reserving phase 3, the post-assessment, where you're actually reviewing and looking at the risk perspective to your skilled resources. And just to level set this a little bit before I hand this off to John so that he can dig into this a little deeper, I want to make what I think is a fairly important point. When I was with Shared Assessments, and I was the program director there for a little over 6 years, we worked very closely with the OCC and the FFIEC on what we were seeing and some ways to effectively streamline the assessment process. And part of that was coming up with ways to handle the pre-assessment and the assessment due diligence process. And very specifically, what both regulatory bodies told us is that they didn't really care how assessment due diligence was compiled. What they cared about was two things. One, that there was a reasonable exercise and investment that went into deciding what due diligence information was needed and should be evaluated based on what services a vendor provided. After that, they wanted to see what risk-based decisions were made as a result of the due diligence information that had been gathered. But how that information came in, whether it was compiled and provided by the vendor proactively, whether it was compiled by a group, or whether it was outsourced and obtained by a contractor, a third party, that was all fine. They just wanted to see that the organization was making the risk-based decisions about what that information showed. Okay? And I think that's an important part because we were doing this and involved with some of this work early on with the regulators. There was a question by some of the constituents within shared assessments as to whether or not the regulators would be bothered or concerned that the institutions were not themselves collecting the information, and that turned out not to be the case. The regulators are really not concerned about that at all. So John, with that as a background, let me hand this over to you so that you can discuss with folks and dive into sort of how can outsourcing, how can managed services really help in these phases of the assessment life cycle.
That's great. Thanks, Brad. So when we look at the pre-assessment phase, I'll dive in a little detail here. Like Brad had mentioned, when we talk about the development of the risk profile, you first need to understand and figure out the vendors that are your critical inherent risk vendors in the organization, which ones are your moderates in the organization, and which ones are the low-profile vendors in the organization. When you do this, it's an exercise that you need to go through, and it takes some guidance from a subject matter expertise to work with the teams with your organization to put together these categories and understand exactly from an access perspective what vendors have access to what data and what levels of access these vendors have. That's going to correlate into helping build out the content, what it is we need to collect from these vendors to get a good understanding. How comprehensive of visibility do we need on this vendor based on their risk profile and their inherent risk to the organization? But also, as Brad had talked about earlier, availability is a very, very big part of that, and that comes outside the realm of security. So when you look at that from the availability perspective, what's the performance of this vendor from an SLA perspective, and what are the details around that, and how does that impact my business as opposed to just my security posture or maturity or risk management, or my risk side of the business. So once we've built that out with the organization, once the managed services breaks that down, then the managed service can also go to the next level and start to develop the questionnaires to understand what content we need to gather from those vendors so that we can be fully aware in a comprehensive manner of what the level of risk is associated with what they have access to and how we're leveraging them to the business today. Lastly is the section of the external threat, which Brad was talking about as well. As we go out and we gather this information from a security perspective to understand their posture and their maturity, and how and in the ways that how they affect our organization, there's areas outside of that realm from an external threat perspective that if you clearly just ask the vendor certain questions, they are not obligated to provide or report or notify in certain areas. So, for example, if you look at breach notifications, if you look at financial risk, certain areas they're not contractually liable to provide information on that. So where a managed service can help is to gather that external intelligence on those specific threat metrics or threat areas and use that information as well when they do their collection, so we can correlate that together to get a real good comprehensive view of the risk associated with the vendor.
Yeah, and John, if I may, just before you move to the next slide, something that if I can just to reinforce here is really the importance of having somebody to help you with the mapping. Didn't talk about that when we were previously talking about the pre-assessment pieces, but you really have to make sure that when you're putting all this together, right, and you talked, John, about making sure you get your questionnaires right, the real next step and part of knowing your questionnaires are right is mapping them to not only your corporate requirements, but do you have industry standards that you need to fall in line with? PCI, for example. Do you want to follow NIST? So a real big piece of this is having that lift and assistance in making sure that you not only get the questionnaires right, but that they're mapped so that you can report on what requirements you are or are not satisfied, whether those are internal or external requirements. So I just wanted to make sure that folks focused on that one as well, John.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brad. That's a very important point. So once we've arrived at what we need to collect, and we've mapped that to specific industry standards that we're following and or to our business requirements, the real heavy lifting portion and the more time-consuming part of the program for vendor risk begins, which is around the assessment phase. And in the assessment phase, it's that collection effort of reaching out to those vendors and collecting the artifacts and getting those questions answered, bringing all that data in centrally into one area so that we have a great view and picture of all the data that has been collected from that vendor. And then the next phase of that process is around the review and analyzing of that data. So from the collection piece of it, like Brad had touched on earlier, that doesn't take a subject matter expertise or someone of advanced level expert knowledge to be able to collect the data. But when the data is collected, to review that data, analyze that data, and understand how to now break down a risk score and understand risks associated with that vendor based on the information that was collected. And even before it gets to the level of measuring the risk, but more importantly, validating that the information that was answered and the data that was collected is in fact accurate. That is a very important part that is done by subject matter expertise in the field. Once we have that data collected, then bringing together that data with the correlated external threat information and producing meaningful reports that satisfy different levels in the organization. As Brad had mentioned earlier, this has now become a board requirement in a lot of organizations. So you look at the operational level, there's specific detailed reports that provide recommendations operationally that need to be addressed with the vendors that have specific deficiencies that make them critical in their risk profile to the organization. But there's also executive summary reports that need to be created and distributed out to the executive branch as well, and also to the board of directors, so they can see in a quick snapshot what areas and what vendors that they do business with, they're most critical, how that affects not only the security of the business, but more about the business side as well, and how it affects business internally and at what level. Brad, you can go to the next slide. So then when we look at the two areas of pre-assessment and the assessment, we look at how the assessment process, the improvements that are seen at the organization level. And really it comes down to, Brad had mentioned, it says here in the slide, 60% of the assessment effort is just done through the initiating of the assessment and collecting of the information, which I talked about on the previous slide. This is a massive amount of time that your organization, you get back from a capacity level and from a resource level. And when you get this amount of significant time back by outsourcing these particular key elements of the risk assessment process, this allows a lot of things. This allows more enablement around dealing with the recommendations that come out of the reports and that we provide you with, because you can now work on the remediation principles. You can start working on the meaningful areas of the risks that were identified. Secondly, it provides scalability. There's a massive amount of scalability to get your head above water in your organization, where you can now meet business demand and you can get to all the vendors in your organization. You have an option to do that because of the time that's been relieved in outsourcing these two critical areas, the pre-assessment and assessment phase. And in addition to that, the output, the multi-level of reporting that you receive back from a managed service as well, it definitely takes that burden off your plate and provides you with those actionable results and meaningful results already cleaned, validated, and presented in multiple formats that can be distributed to your organization, and takes that burden off as well. So with that, I want to bring this back to Brad so he can wrap this up and go into how this actually benefits the organization beyond that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. And I think I'm going to sit here, I'm going to hover on this slide here for just a moment longer, because it really is a really important piece here, and that is, the resource capacity that you gain from managed services is substantial. With the amount of time, and our experience shows, and my studies that I've seen, both here at Prevalent and before the 6-some-odd years I spent at Shared Assessments, shows that you're freeing up potentially 60% of your resources time. That's a big deal, and it's an easy lift. So first and foremost, when we talk about the benefits of adding managed services, what John just walked through, it's really that huge lift that you're getting in additional resource capacity, and that can't be understated. But what are you getting here? What are the real benefits? And they really start from the very beginning. And again, as I'm about to go through this, I've seen a couple of questions come in. For folks, please, we're going to hit the questions soon. If you've got some questions or things you'd like to know some more about, please drop those in, and we'll get to them at the end of our presentation. We can add those to the list that we've already gotten started. But when we talk about the benefits of managed services, it really starts from the beginning. And it's having help in getting your foundational pieces right. When you bring in a managed service to help in this area, what you've got is you're bringing in people who have a tremendous amount of expertise in the area of third-party risk, of designing and building the component and building parts of this program. And that really is going to help you get things right as it comes to how do I risk classify my vendors? How do I risk rate different kinds of services? How do I risk weight what gets done and get things properly mapped so that I can show that I am in compliance with corporate or external requirements? Okay, it's getting all that documentation and that analysis right so that you know that you've got a firm foundation to start from. And having folks with a broad and deep experience doing this, really helps make that happen and get that right from the beginning. Not to say that you may not have folks that have got some experience or good experience in this, but the more minds that you can bring to bear on this, the broader the experience, the tighter you're going to get it, and the better you're going to have it done. And just, by way of a reminder, particularly for those who are regulated or are subject to internal audits from this, I've fronted and been responsible for a great number of assessments and regulatory examinations ranging from the stock exchange to the SEC to the OCC to the Fed, and they all, and internal auditors as well, and they all share a common theme, which is if you're not able to provide written documentation for why you do something, as well as documentation for how you execute against what you do, for all intents and purposes, you get no credit for doing it. So, one of the challenges that can come up if you're not getting your foundational pieces right is you may do it very well. But if you don't have documentation for how you arrived at why you're doing what you're doing a certain way, and that you do it in a uniform, consistent fashion, neither the regulators or your own internal audit staff are going to give you credit for the fine job you may actually be doing. And that's a risk that certainly if you're regulated you can't afford to take, and it's an embarrassment at the senior management level if it's something that becomes an internal audit finding. So really important that you get this right. Another big benefit is what we just talked about with staff requirements and freeing up that resource capacity. And, I always call it gives resources the ability to focus on truly value-added work. If you have folks who truly are risk professionals, they don't need to be spending 60% of their time in work that doesn't need to be done by a risk professional. Let them focus on the value-added work and leverage their skill sets on doing those things that they do best, identifying, evaluating, and mitigating risk. Okay? That's going to give them time to really make their recommendations, to conduct remediation, and equally important, to provide meaningful reports. Because again, no matter how well you may be managing the risk that you're exposed to from outsourced service providers, if you're not able to report on how you manage that risk, then you're not going to get any credit for it, and management isn't going to understand the good job that you may be doing, or may not fully understand the load that you're under, the challenges that you face to help you get the resources that you need. So proper reporting really is the grease that moves the wheel, that lets you show the job you're doing or get the resources you need to be able to do that job. Okay. The other piece of this is managed services will bring in some external threats, and look at your external threat environment and things that exist outside the contract, and bring that in and let your people work on that and be a part of things. It really needs to be very freeing, and most importantly too, when we look at the last bullet here, and that is it lets your processes be flexible. Right? It lets you, by relying on subject matter experts in the field that can help you refine and define your processes and change those as needs change, because corporate requirements are going to change, just like technology changes and is a driver behind changes in security controls. It lets you be flexible. It lets you have the resource lift and the ability to modify and change your processes to be in alignment with this very dynamic environment that we have in third-party risk management. One of the big things that happened in third-party risk is all around mobile devices. Okay, if you think about it, one really important thing is everything that you do as a company around technology or changes. So you've decided now that through mobile devices, you're going to allow people to use those devices to execute their job, to access certain applications and perform certain functions. Well, guess what? Your vendors are operating a business and they're striving and driving efficiency in the same way. So now, because of the improvements and enhancements over the years in mobile device technology, now your vendors are doing that. Okay? Well, that means that suddenly now you have to adapt what you do, and first you have to know, gee, how can mobile device access create additional risk for me? What kind of controls are reasonable for me to expect a vendor to have in place? And then go out and find out if, in fact, they're executing them. So, mobile devices is just one illustration of how technology can change and influence and impact what you need to change in your processes around assessments and security risk controls. So, John, anything else that you'd want to add to the real benefits here of looking at managed services here?
No, Brad, I think you really hit on all of it, and I can't stress enough about what you had mentioned as well, that the time that you're saving and allowing your resources to get cycles and time in their schedule to work on areas that are more meaningful to the organization is the critical mass here. That's the critical piece of all of this.
Right. Well, great. Thanks, John. And again, I want to get to some of the questions that we've seen come in. If you'd like to add to the list, please feel free to send something in through the chat. So we'll wrap up now with a little Q&A session with some of the things that have come in. So well, the first question that I got, and I think it's certainly timely and appropriate here, is how do I identify who's qualified to provide managed services in this area? It's an interesting question, and it's a question that I was getting even back when I was with shared assessments, when members would come and say, how do I know, right, if this is a company who really has the skill sets and can help me, in this area? The easy and glib answer to that is, well, you just talk to my friend John Police over at PSS, and I know if you go to the races. But I think that the person asking the question was probably looking for a little broader and deeper response than that. So really, if you want to try and look at who's qualified to do this, you really want to look at what do they bring to the table, right? I mentioned the Shared Assessments Certified Third-Party Risk Professionals program. I should probably caveat by saying that I was and still am substantially involved in that program, but it is to date still the only formal training and certification program in third-party risk. So look and see whether the folks that are coming to the table, do they have certifications? Equally important is find out from them what is going to be the nature of their deliverables. Okay, what experience do they have in delivering this? What's it going to look like? They're going to do an assessment, that's fine, but you're relying on their work product, their deliverable, to set the stage and free up your resources to be able to make risk-based decisions about whether a vendor has to put controls in place, whether contracts need to be changed. So you really want to find out from them, what is their deliverable going to look like? What's that report going to look like? Okay. Spend some time finding out how they do this and what experience they have helping on the front end, right? What is their experience around driving and designing deliverables or requirements? Okay. And what does that look like? So dig in and find out not just their background, but what would they propose based on your circumstances the deliverable looks like. Okay? And then you're in a position to be able to know, okay, is this something that I can use? I've actually been involved in many instances where we've come in after someone had been using another service, and I've been surprised to see the scope and the difference between nominally, what you don't want, and what a lot of folks will do with a managed service, is they just collect the information to hand it to you and say, here's your questionnaire, it's been answered, and here's the documents you asked for. They don't provide any insight into what that means or provide you with recommendations on what to do. Well, ultimately, the risk decisions are your choice, and they need to be your choice. Someone should be providing you with a recommendation for course of action. Okay. Let's take a look. Okay, here's another good question, and both John and I have brought up, and we talked about here when we talk about the benefits of managed service, the external threats. And the question is, we talked about external threat intelligence and external threats. What really does that mean? What are we really talking about? And I made a reference when we talked about the benefits. When we talk about external threats, you have to remember that when you're doing an assessment, what you're getting is a static point of view at the time. And you're really only getting from the vendor that which the vendor is required to tell you about as part of the contract. Okay? So there's a whole world of information out there that they're not required to provide you with. They're not required affirmatively to tell you that they're under investigation by the SEC. They're not required to tell you about breach incidents that don't involve your data. They're not required to tell you about a lawsuit that's been filed that could prevent them from providing you with the service they provide to you. So there's a whole world of things that happen in the internet from a reputation standpoint. Lawsuits and regulatory actions, and certainly the financial stability of the company are all things that they're external threats. And by a threat, I mean it's a threat to that vendor being able to provide that service to you. Okay. And this is an important piece, and it's something that a good comprehensive managed service is going to do. They're going to provide you with insight into the things that happen outside of the four corners of your contract. An example real quickly, I know we're starting to run short on time, but an example, real-world example real quickly of where that was relevant. I have a client who stopped using a service from Oracle and used it from another supplier to provide that same service. What they didn't know while they were in the process of negotiating that contract was that that vendor had been sued by Oracle and had asked for an injunction to prevent that vendor from providing that service because they were claiming business patent infringement. Okay? What ended up happening was that injunction was granted. So now here sat my client without the benefit of that service because the vendor that they contracted with couldn't provide it, and they found themselves without that service and having to go hat in hand back to Oracle to get that service put in place, which caused them meaningful and significant business disruption. The vendor, because their official SEC filed statement was that they thought that they would successfully defend the litigation, which is pretty much the standard response, didn't believe they were compelled to inform my client that this was going on. Had the client known that this was filed, they could have found another service. They certainly would not have concluded a contract with this vendor for a service that the vendor might not have been able to provide. So that's just sort of a real-world example of where external threat intelligence can give you a way to be proactive, and that's really what external threat is. It's usually not a single thing that says I have to terminate my contract or a single thing that institutes breach of contract, but it gives you the ability to be proactive and identify a risk and begin addressing it with your vendor, because keep in mind, all your critical vendors really are critical business partners. That's the role they play. So it lets you get in front of these issues and keep them from becoming incidents. That's the real value. It's really why you're doing your assessments, is you're trying to keep bad things from happening. And finding out external threat information really does help with that. So that's, I see we're running short on time. Please, if you've sent in questions and I didn't get a chance to get to them, my apologies. We will certainly respond to those outside of the webinar and get back to folks. But with that having been said, John and I would like to thank you for your time and your participation. Hopefully everyone found this to be beneficial and useful, and we look forward to having you participate in one of our future webinars. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.